All right, so this week you sent in a pretty massive stack of stuff.
Yeah.
It looks like it's all about the trade war.
Right.
And, honestly, looking at all this, I can see why you might feel a little overwhelmed by it all.
I can imagine.
It's a lot.
Absolutely.
So we thought it'd be really helpful to just kind of do a deep dive into this stuff.
Yeah.
Try to understand it all without getting lost in the weeds.
That's a great idea.
So our mission today, if you will, is to unpack what exactly a trade war is.
All right.
How do these things even happen?
Right.
And maybe most importantly, we want to try to figure out how all this impacts you as a consumer in your everyday life.
Absolutely.
So we dove into all the pasted text you sent.
Okay.
And there's some really interesting stuff in there.
Sounds like it.
I mean, I don't know. Have you ever heard about trade wars and wondered what they really mean for you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, how does it actually affect me?
It's a big question.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
All right, let's do it.
So first things first, what exactly is a trade war?
Okay, so basically a trade war is when countries get into a kind of economic fight with each other.
Okay.
And they start throwing up barriers to trade.
Right.
Because they feel like they're being treated unfairly or, there's some kind of economic dispute going on. And the most common weapon in a trade war is something called a tariff.
Okay.
And a tariff is basically just a tax that a country puts on goods that are coming in from another country.
Okay, so like, say for example, one country decides to put a tariff on TVs coming in from another country.
Yeah.
What happens then?
Well, what's going to happen is the price of those TVs is going to go up.
Right.
For people in the country that put the tariff in place.
Right.
So it just becomes more expensive to buy that imported TV.
Right.
And then usually the country whose TVs are being taxed, they're going to retaliate.
Okay.
And they'll put tariffs on goods coming in from the first country.
Right.
So it kind of creates this back and forth.
Okay, like a tit for tat?
Yeah. Exactly. A tit for tat kind of escalation.
So it's like a pricing battle.
Yeah.
But instead of trying to have the lowest price, they're trying to make each other's products more expensive.
Right.
To make them less appealing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, now, one of the things that came up a lot in the stuff you sent was this idea of trade imbalances.
Yes.
So what does that even mean?
So a trade imbalance is when one country is importing way more stuff from another country than they're exporting to that country.
Right.
So they're buying a lot more than they're selling.
Okay.
And a classic example of this that came up in the materials you provided is the relationship between the U.S. and China, where the U.S. has historically bought a lot more from China than it's sold to China.
Okay.
And this can lead to feelings of resentment.
Correct.
Because the country with the bigger trade deficit might feel like they're getting a raw deal.
Yeah, like they're being taken advantage of.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have these imbalances, but then there's also this idea of unfair trade practices.
Yes.
Which also came up a lot.
Definitely.
So what exactly are those?
So that's where things get a little more complicated.
Okay.
Your materials talked about a few things. One big one is subsidies.
Okay.
So a subsidy is basically when a government gives money to its own industries to help them out. And this can make their products cheaper on the global market, which can give them an advantage over companies in other countries.
So it's like giving one player a special advantage.
Exactly.
That the others don't have.
Yeah.
Okay, what else is considered an unfair trade practice?
Another one that your sources talked about a lot was intellectual property theft.
Right.
And that's basically when one country steals technology or patents or ideas from companies in another country.
Okay.
And this can really hurt the country whose ideas are being stolen.
Yeah, like if a company spends a lot of money on research and development.
Right.
And then someone just comes in and steals it all.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not fair.
That undermines the whole system.
Okay. And then there was also currency manipulation.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So currency manipulation is when a country tries to make its own currency weaker compared to other currencies. And they do this because it makes their exports cheaper for buyers in other countries.
Right.
So it makes their products more attractive on the global market.
Okay. So like if my local currency suddenly became worth a lot less compared to other currencies, then all of a sudden everything I make locally would be really cheap for people overseas.
Exactly. It's like an instant sale.
Okay, so if a country feels like these kinds of things are happening, they might decide to use tariffs or sanctions as a way to kind of even things out.
Yeah, they're basically trying to put pressure on the other country to change their behavior.
Right.
But like we said before, This can lead to retaliation.
Right.
And that's how a trade dispute can escalate into a full-blown trade war.
Okay, so we've got trade imbalances, we've got these unfair practices, but the materials you sent also mentioned a lot of political factors.
Yes.
That contribute to trade wars.
Definitely.
So how does politics play into this whole thing?
Well, governments are often under pressure from their own industries that are struggling to compete with imports from other countries. So these industries might lobby the government to put up tariffs and protect them.
Right.
And then on top of that, political leaders sometimes use trade wars as a way to look tough on the world stage or to appeal to nationalist sentiment at home.
So they might start a trade war to boost their own popularity.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got trade imbalances, unfair practices, and political pressures.
Right.
Now let's talk about a real-world example.
Okay.
The trade war between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, a big one.
Can you walk us through how that all started?
So the trade war between the U.S. and China really heated up in 2018. And, this was really a culmination of a lot of the factors we've been talking about.
Okay.
So the U.S. had concerns about China's trade practices for a long time.
Right.
There were accusations of intellectual property theft.
Yeah.
American companies felt like their technology was being stolen. There were complaints about forced technology transfers where U.S. companies felt like they were being pressured to share their technology just to be able to do business in China. Right. And, of course, currency manipulation was a big issue, too.
Right.
So the U.S. government at the time felt like all these practices were putting American industries at a disadvantage.
Okay, so what did they do?
Well, in 2018, they started slapping tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods.
Wow.
Yeah. This wasn't just like a small targeted thing. It was a pretty big escalation.
Okay. And how did China react to that?
Well, they didn't just sit there and take it.
Right.
They retaliated.
Okay.
And they put their own tariffs on American goods.
Like what kind of goods?
Everything from agricultural products like soybeans to all sorts of manufactured goods. So it was basically this back and forth.
Yeah, a real trade war.
Exactly, a full-blown trade war.
Okay, so what were some of the consequences of this trade war?
Well, one of the most obvious consequences was that prices went up for consumers.
On both sides.
On both sides. So, when you put tariffs on imported goods, it basically adds to the cost of those goods.
Right.
And businesses usually end up passing at least some of that cost on to consumers.
Okay, so if I'm buying a TV or a phone or whatever that was made in China, I'm going to have to pay more for it.
Yeah, exactly.
And same thing for people in China buying American products.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so prices went up, but what about the materials you sent? Also mentioned something about global supply chains being disrupted.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it.
Okay, so can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So in today's world, a lot of products are made with parts that come from all over the place. So companies have these complex global supply chains.
Right.
And when the U.S. and China put up all these tariffs, it created a lot of uncertainty, and it made things more expensive for companies that relied on those supply chains.
Right.
So companies had to scramble to find new suppliers, which took time and cost money.
And that affects industries all over the world.
Yeah, it's not just a U.S.-China thing.
Okay.
It's a global thing.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So let's say you want to buy a washing machine.
Okay.
Some of the parts for that washing machine might come from China. Some might come from Mexico.
Right.
Some might come from who knows where.
Yeah.
So if there's a tariff on even one of those parts, it can affect the price of the final product and how easily you can actually get your hands on it.
Okay, so it's not just about finding new suppliers either.
Right. It's also about what happens to the businesses themselves.
Yeah. What happens to the companies that are caught in the middle of all this?
Exactly. So U.S. businesses that relied on imports from China, they saw their production costs go up.
Because of the tariffs?
Exactly. So they had a few options.
Okay.
They could try to absorb that extra cost,
right,
which would eat into their profits.
Yeah.
Or they could try to find new suppliers, which, like we said, could be expensive and time-consuming.
Right.
Or they could pass those costs on to consumers.
Which would mean higher prices.
Exactly.
And some companies even considered moving their operations out of China.
Yeah, that was another option.
Just to avoid the tariffs altogether.
Right.
Wow. So it seems like businesses had some tough choices to make.
Oh, definitely. It was a really challenging time for a lot of companies.
The one thing that came up in the material was this thing called the Phase 1 deal.
Yes.
What was that all about?
So the Phase 1 deal was signed in January of 2020.
Okay.
And it was Basically an attempt to de-escalate the trade war.
Okay, so cool. The trade war is over.
Well, not so fast.
Okay.
It was a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm.
But it didn't solve everything.
Okay.
So as part of the deal, China agreed to buy more American goods, especially agricultural products.
Right.
And in return, the U.S. agreed to reduce or remove some of the tariffs.
Okay.
And China also promised to address some of the concerns about intellectual property theft and stuff like that.
So it sounds like a good deal.
It was a positive development.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that a lot of the tariffs stayed in place.
Right.
And a lot of the underlying issues weren't really resolved.
So the trade war wasn't really over?
It was more like a pause or a truce.
Gotcha.
But the tensions were still there.
Okay, now let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the broader impact of trade wars.
Okay.
So the material you sent really emphasized that trade wars don't just affect the countries that are directly involved.
Right.
They have global consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
So when you have big economies like the U.S. and China...
Getting into a trade war, it creates ripple effects throughout the whole global economy.
Okay. How so?
Well, for one thing, it can slow down global trade.
Okay.
Because when countries put up barriers to trade... it makes it harder and more expensive for everyone to do business with each other.
Right.
And that can lead to slower economic growth worldwide.
Okay. And we talked about supply chains before.
Yeah.
But how are they affected by trade wars on a global scale?
So think about it like this.
Okay.
Let's say you have a U.S. company that makes smartphones.
Okay.
And they use parts that come from China.
Right.
Now, if there are tariffs on those Chinese parts, it's going to make those phones more expensive to produce. And it might even cause delays if the company can't find new suppliers quickly.
Right.
So this not only affects the U.S. company and American consumers, it also affects the Chinese suppliers and potentially other countries that are involved in that supply chain.
Wow. So it's really interconnected.
It is incredibly interconnected.
Okay. And the material also mentioned something about economic slowdowns.
Yes.
Like, how do trade wars actually cause those?
So when businesses face higher costs because of tariffs, and they're not sure what's going to happen with trade policy in the future, they get really hesitant to invest.
Okay.
So they might not want to expand their business or hire more workers, or they might even have to lay off workers.
Okay.
And that can lead to slower economic growth and job losses.
And this can affect not just the countries involved in the trade war.
Right. It can also hurt smaller countries that depend on trade with those bigger countries.
Gotcha.
So it's like a domino effect.
Okay. And then finally, the material talked about currency fluctuations.
Yeah.
So how do trade wars affect exchange rates?
So sometimes when a country is hit with tariffs, they might try to devalue their own currency.
Okay. Why would they do that?
Well, it makes their exports cheaper. So it can help to offset some of the negative effects of the tariffs.
Okay.
But this can lead to a lot of volatility in exchange rates.
Right.
Which can make it harder to plan for the future.
Yeah.
And it can also affect things like the cost of international travel.
Okay, so we've talked about what trade wars are. We've talked about how they start.
Yeah.
We've talked about the U.S.-China trade war as an example. And we've talked about the global impact of trade wars. Now let's bring it back to you, our listener.
Right.
How does all this affect you personally as a consumer?
So this is where it gets real.
Yeah.
The most direct impact you're likely to see is higher prices.
Right.
Because when there are tariffs on imported goods, those costs often get passed on to you.
To the consumer.
Exactly.
Okay.
So whether it's the clothes you buy or the electronics you buy or even some of the food you buy, you might end up paying more because of these trade disputes.
Okay, so like what kind of specific things?
Well, the materials you sent mentioned things like smartphones, washing machines, groceries. Those are all things that could become more expensive.
Because of tariffs.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just about the price though, right?
Right.
Your materials also talked about limited product availability.
Yes.
So what does that mean for the average consumer?
So basically it means that some products might become harder to find. Okay. You know, if companies are having trouble finding suppliers because of trade disruptions, you might see more things out of stock, or you might have to wait longer for deliveries, or some products might just become scarce.
Wow. So like I might go to the store and the thing I want just isn't there.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's also this idea of economic uncertainty.
Yes.
So how does that affect consumer behavior?
So when there's a lot of uncertainty about the economy,
Yeah.
people tend to be more cautious with their spending.
Okay.
So they might hold off on making big purchases.
Right. Or they might just buy less stuff in general.
Especially non-essential items.
Right. Things they can live without.
Okay. And this can hurt businesses.
Yes, definitely.
Especially small businesses.
Right. Because they rely on people spending money.
Okay. And then finally, your materials talked about job losses.
Yeah.
So how does that connect back to the individual consumer?
Well, even if you're not personally losing your job,
right?
If a lot of other people are losing their jobs, it can hurt the overall economy.
Okay.
Which can ultimately affect everyone.
Right.
Because people have less money to spend.
So it can become a vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Okay, so to sum it all up, trade wars are complex.
They are.
They often start because of trade imbalances or unfair practices.
Right.
And they can have really serious consequences for the global economy.
Absolutely.
But for you, the average consumer, the main things you're likely to notice are higher prices and economic uncertainty.
And the U.S.-China trade war was a perfect example of all this playing out in the real world.
Yeah, it was a case study in how these things can really affect people's lives.
And it shows just how interconnected the global economy really is.
Yeah, we're all in this together.
Exactly. So, next time you're at the store and you see that the price of something has gone up.
Right.
Or maybe the thing you want is out of stock.
Yeah.
Think about how global trade policies might be playing a role.
It's definitely something to consider.
Thanks for diving into this with us today.
My pleasure.
It's been really insightful.
I agree.
And for you, our listener, think about the things you buy regularly.
Yeah.
And how those global trade policies we talked about might be affecting what you buy.
Definitely.
How much you pay for it.
Absolutely.
Something to think about.
Food for thought.
Until next time.
See you.